Homeless girl pleaded to stay in a millionaire's doghouse. His reply left everyone speechless. The night was merciless, dark clouds swallowing the moon as rain fell in heavy sheets that flooded the empty sidewalks and pounded against the ground like shattered glass. Emily staggered along the deserted street, her thin sweater clinging to her soaked skin as the cold cut through her bones like a knife. Her shoes squished with every miserable step, heavy with water, and her breath came out in trembling gasps. She had nowhere left to go. Every shelter she had tried earlier was already full, and the alleyways she once considered were now threatening with shadows and unseen dangers. Hunger clawed at her empty stomach, but fear gnawed at her heart even stronger. She was exhausted, barely holding herself upright, when her eyes fell upon the Carter estate standing like a fortress at the end of the block. The tall iron gates looked unforgiving, but beyond them, the mansion lights glowed faintly through the storm, offering a promise of warmth that felt painfully out of reach. She clutched her trembling hands together and whispered into the storm, "If only I had a corner to hide." Her gaze drifted past the yard, and that's when she noticed it. A large doghouse. Its roof was slanted and sturdy, keeping the inside safe and dry from the storm, with hay piled at the bottom that looked warmer than any bed she had known in weeks. Even from where she stood, it appeared more inviting than the cruel street beneath her feet. The realization stung her eyes with tears as she thought bitterly, "Even the dogs here live better than me." She bit her lip hard, trying to choke down the sob that threatened to escape. The storm roared louder, thunder rattling her ribs, and almost seemed to push her closer to the gates. She stepped forward hesitantly, her heart pounding like a drum. The iron bars towered before her, reflecting her broken face in their wet surface. Lightning flashed, outlining the mansion like a palace from some distant fairy tale, but Emily knew she was no princess, just a girl with nothing left. Without family, without safety, without hope, her throat tightened with shame, yet survival left no room for pride. "Maybe, just for one night," she whispered again, though her words were swallowed by the thunder. Gathering the last thread of courage, she lifted her hand toward the gate, ready to knock, but the sound of footsteps from within froze her blood. Heavy, deliberate steps echoed closer until the gate creaked open slightly. A tall figure emerged beneath a black umbrella, moving with a commanding stride that spoke of power. His coat was perfectly tailored, untouched by the rain, and his polished shoes gleamed even under the storm's fury. Even drenched in darkness, he radiated an authority that made Emily shrink back in fear. It was James Carter, the millionaire himself, the man whose name every corner of the city knew. To Emily, he looked less like a man and more like a king. She stumbled back, startled, but his sharp eyes immediately found her fragile figure at the gate. His gaze swept over her dripping hair plastered to her cheeks, her pale lips quivering from the cold, and her trembling body that barely held itself upright. His brows furrowed slightly as if in confusion, but Emily panicked, her mind racing. What if he calls the police? Her knees shook violently, and she lowered her eyes to the ground. I'm sorry," she stammered, even though he hadn't spoken. James stopped a few feet away, silent, the storm raging around them, yet his presence drowning everything else. Emily's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, every second dragging like eternity. Her courage was about to collapse when the thought of that doghouse flashed again in her mind, pushy, rang her to act. She dropped to her knees in the wet mud, the icy water soaking into her skin, her hands pressing into the ground as her entire body trembled. "Please, sir," she managed to choke out, her voice nearly lost in the storm. James tilted his head slightly, the only sign that he had heard her. The guards standing by the gate stiffened, exchanging confused glances, for never before had anyone knelt like this before him. Emily's eyes shone with desperation as she lifted them toward him, tears mixing with rain. "Please, let me sleep. In your doghouse tonight." The words left her mouth like shards of glass, and the silence that followed was more suffocating than the storm itself. One of the guards muttered under his breath, unable to believe what he'd heard. James's expression hardened, unreadable, his umbrella tilting as droplets rolled off its edge. Lightning illuminated Emily's face, fragile and broken, her fingers clutching at the iron gate. "I won't ask for food, or clothes, or money," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Just a roof, even if it's for your dog." The words hung in the stormy air like a prayer. James's jaw tightened, his sharp eyes narrowing as if trying to read her soul. He had heard people beg for money, for jobs, for favors, but never this. Emily dared to meet his stare, though it pierced through her like a blade. She shuddered, yet refused to look away, her knees burning against the hard ground, her sweater clinging like a second skin. Every shiver made her weaker, but she remained there, clinging to the only hope she had left. James inhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold, and for one strange moment it felt as if the storm itself had paused. Emily's lips parted to beg again, but her voice failed her, and she lowered her forehead to the muddy ground. "Please," she whispered one final time, her words breaking. The guards shifted uneasily, waiting for an order, yet James remained motionless, his expression unreadable, his umbrella dripping quietly in the storm. He froze, staring at the fragile girl kneeling before him, her fists clenched in the mud, her body trembling as she waited for his verdict. Would he throw her out, or listen? The silence stretched in the storm, heavier than the rain itself, as James Carter's piercing gaze remained fixed on the fragile girl kneeling in the mud. The guards shifted uncomfortably, their patience thinning. Mark, the head guard, finally broke the stillness, his deep voice sharp and unfriendly. "You can't be here, girl," he growled, stepping forward as if to drag her away. Emily flinched at the sound, her shoulders curling inward like a child bracing for a blow, but she forced herself not to move. Her lips parted, her voice trembling as she managed to speak over the storm. "I don't need money," she whispered. Then louder, desperate. "I don't need anything but the doghouse. Please. Just that." The words hung in the air, fragile but unyielding. Mark scowled, baffled by her audacity, muttering under his breath, "This is ridiculous." The other guard exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for James's command, but James didn't react, not yet. Instead, he studied her in silence, his eyes moving slowly over the soaked clothes clinging to her frail frame, the mud smeared on her knees, the bruises on her thin hands, and the hollow shadows beneath her eyes that told a story of suffering far deeper than her words revealed. Emily shivered under the weight of his scrutiny, but she didn't drop her gaze this time. She held on with the fragile courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. The rain poured harder, each drop striking her bowed head like needles, yet she stayed there, kneeling, her breath coming in uneven bursts. James's silence was unbearable, and Emily's throat tightened as if her own voice was betraying her, but she forced herself to speak again. "I swear I won't bother anyone," she said, almost choking on the words. "I'll be Q. Yet, I'll stay out of sight. Just let me stay where it's dry." Her voice cracked, and a sob slipped through, echoing against the iron gate. Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "Pathetic. She's wasting your time, sir." But James's hand lifted slightly, a gesture that silenced the guard instantly. His expression remained unreadable, carved like stone, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something darker, curiosity perhaps, or confusion. He took one measured step closer, the umbrella shifting with him, droplets sliding down its edges. Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She pressed her palms into the wet ground, trembling, and lifted her head just enough to see him. His shadow loomed over her, tall and commanding, the storm swirling like a backdrop to his authority. James's voice finally broke the silence, deep and deliberate, carrying easily even over the storm. "Why the doghouse?" The question cut through the night like a blade, unexpected and chilling. Emily froze, the words striking her harder than the rain. Her lips trembled, her mind racing with panic. Did he want her gone? Was he mocking her? The guard stared too, waiting to see if she would answer or falter. Her hands curled tighter into the mud, nails digging into the earth, her chest heaving as tears burned her eyes. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her face toward him. Lightning illuminated her features, her pale cheeks, her rain-soaked lashes, her trembling mouth, as she forced the truth out in a single broken breath. "Because your dogs," she whispered, each word heavier than the last, "are living a better life than me." The storm swallowed her voice, but not enough to hide the raw pain it carried. For a long, unbearable moment, everything stilled. The guards, the rain, even James himself. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. Would he dismiss her with cruelty? Or would the truth in her words pierce the armor around his heart? The silence grew sharper, almost suffocating. As Emily's gaze wavered between the mud and his dark, unreadable eyes, James's face, unreadable moments before, shifted suddenly, the faint flicker in his eyes vanishing as his jaw tightened and his expression hardened into something cold, distant, and final. The weight of authority laced his voice as he spoke with a sharp edge that cut through the storm. "You cannot stay in my doghouse," he declared, each word crisp and merciless. The sound shattered the fragile hope clinging to Emily's chest, and the force of it was like a door slamming shut in her face. Her breath caught, her lips parted as if to plead again, but nothing came out except the raw sob that broke free, uninvited and unstoppable. Tears streamed hot against the chill of the rain, mingling with the storm as her vision blurred. She lowered her head quickly, ashamed of her weakness, ashamed of the tears she could not hold back. Her hands slipped in the mud as she scrambled clumsily to her feet, her body heavy with despair. The guards stood rigid, almost satisfied with the command, their eyes hard and expectant. Emily turned slowly, her steps faltering, her legs trembling as though each movement cost her more than she could afford to give. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing into her back, but none of them mattered now. The fragile thread of hope she had clung to was gone, torn apart by his refusal. The storm seemed to roar louder, as though mocking her defeat, as she faced the open street again, dark, endless, and merciless. A lump rose in her throat, choking her as she lifted her foot to take the first step away. Her world had collapsed in silence, her heart breaking so loudly she swore the thunder must echo it. Yet, as she moved toward the storm's jaws, a soft rustle from the mansion caught her attention. The grand door at the entrance had opened just enough to reveal the figure of a woman standing in the warm glow inside. It was Mrs. Thompson, the longtime seakeeper, her kind eyes watching from the threshold with concern. She gripped the edge of the doorway as if restraining herself from rushing forward, torn between duty and compassion. Her brows furrowed deeply, her lips pressed tightly together, and her entire face betrayed the worry she felt for the fragile girl about to vanish into the storm. Emily caught sight of her for only a second, but even that fleeting look stung with unbearable contrast. Warmth and safety glowing behind the door, while she herself stood drenched and discarded outside. She lowered her gaze quickly, unable to bear the reminder. With a final shaky breath, Emily shifted her weight forward, her body tilting into the storm as she prepared to take the step that would seal her fate, the step back into the darkness she had fought so hard to escape. And then it happened. The air shifted. A voice, firm and commanding, sliced through the thunder like lightning itself. "Wait." The single word froze her mid-step, her foot hovering above the muddy ground. She stiffened, her shoulders trembling, her breath lodged in her chest. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she turned her head back toward the gate. James Carter stood unmoved, the umbrella still above him, his presence unshaken by the chaos of the storm. His eyes, sharp as ever, were locked on her, but there was something different in them now, something unreadable, something no one present could quite name. The guards blinked, startled, their expressions breaking into confusion. Mrs. Thompson's hand pressed tighter against the doorframe, her heart caught in her throat. The storm's roar seemed to hush, as though the world itself was waiting for what would follow. James's voice rose again, deliberate and steady, carrying the weight of a man who was not asking, but declaring a thought that confused even himself. If not the doghouse. He paused, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Then where? His words struck like a thunderclap louder than the storm, echoing in the silence that followed. The guards exchanged bewildered glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. Emily's lips parted, her tears pausing midstream, confusion overtaking despair. Mrs. Thompson gasped softly from the doorway, her heart lurching as the meaning of his words sank in. The storm raged on, but none of them moved, all caught in the weight of the question that hung between them. What did he mean? Where else could she go? Why had he stopped her? The night held its breath, suspended on the edge of something no one could yet define. The silence after James's unexpected question still lingered in the air, heavy and charged, but before anyone could break it, he moved decisively, stepping closer to the gate. The storm rolled overhead, but his words cut through it, steady and commanding. "Come with me," he said simply, his gaze fixed on Emily. She blinked in disbelief, unsure if her ears had betrayed her, but the authority in his voice left no room for doubt. The guards shifted uneasily, their postures stiff with confusion, but none dared question him. Emily hesitated, her soaked body trembling, her mind torn between fear and the faint spark of hope reigniting within her chest. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped back toward the gate, each movement feeling unreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake from. When she finally crossed into the estate grounds, the enormity of the mansion loomed over her like a cathedral, its windows glowing against the storm as though holding secrets behind their walls. James walked with measured steps, leading her toward the entrance without a glance backward, his tall figure radiating command even in silence. As Emily followed, the mud squelched beneath her thin shoes, her heart pounding with every step closer to the unknown. At the doorway, Mrs. Thompson moved aside quickly, her eyes wide with relief but also wary curiosity. She clutched her apron tightly, whispering a prayer under her breath as Emily passed her. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with polished wood and spices, and the shift from the storm's cruelty to the mansion's embrace almost knocked Emily off balance. But before she could absorb the comfort, James's voice sliced the calm. "Don't mistake this for charity," he warned firmly, his tone sharp as steel. "I don't trust strangers. If you stay here tonight, you'll follow my rules." His eyes burned into her, testing her resolve, measuring her every flinch. Emily swallowed hard, nodding quickly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I will. I'll follow whatever you say." The staff, gathered discreetly in the shadows of the hall, exchanged whispers, their eyes darting between their master and the fragile girl, dripping on the marble floor. To them, this was not kindness. It was a test, one they could not yet understand. Mrs. Thompson's expression softened, her motherly instincts aching to comfort Emily, but she stayed silent, knowing James would not appreciate interference. James turned briskly, gesturing for Emily to follow him deeper into the mansion. She trailed him, her eyes wide, soaking in every detail, the glittering chandelier above, the polished floor that reflected their movements, the vast paintings that seemed to watch her as she walked. It was a world far removed from her own, a world she never imagined stepping into. Yet here she was, an intruder caught in the storm's mercy and a millionaire's scrutiny. They entered a grand dining hall where the long mahogany table stretched like a river of wealth, adorned with silver and crystal. At its center sat a single place setting, steam rising from a bowl of soup that seemed to glow with promise. Emily's knees nearly buckled at the sight. The scent of warmth and nourishment drifted toward her, overwhelming her senses. James motioned for her to sit, his eyes never leaving hers, as though every blink, every breath, was part of the unspoken test he had laid before her. She lowered herself onto the chair cautiously, her hands trembling against the polished wood. her reflection wavering in the silver spoon beside her. The staff lingered at the edges of the room, whispering still, some skeptical, some curious, others silently hoping the girl would pass whatever trial their master had in mind. Emily lowered her gaze, afraid of the attention, but hunger gnawed so fiercely at her that she could not ignore the steaming bowl before her. James stood at the head of the table, his arms folded, his presence looming larger than life as he watched. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace at the far end of the hall. Emily hesitated, then reached for the spoon, her fingers shaking, the metal cold against her skin. She lifted it slowly, dipping it into the soup, her throat tightening with anticipation and fear. The aroma rose stronger, tugging at every desperate need in her body. For a moment, the world shrank to just her, the soup, and the eyes watching her every move. She raised the spoon toward her lips, her stomach twisting, her hands unsteady. And just as she took her first bite, the warmth sliding onto her tongue like salvation, James's voice broke the silence in a low, deliberate tone. "Tell me the truth," he said, his gaze narrowing, his words heavy with suspicion. Emily froze mid-chew, the spoon hovering in her trembling hand as if it had turned to stone. The soup burned down her throat, but the chill of his question froze her blood. His eyes locked on her, unblinking, demanding. "Why are you really here?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above her, sharp and merciless. Emily's heart pounded violently, her breath shallow, her fingers twitching around the spoon as if they might drop it. Every whisper in the room silenced intently, every staff member holding their breath. The fire crackled louder, filling the void. Emily's lips quivered, her eyes darting downward, unable to meet his gaze. The truth pressed heavy against her chest, but the fear of speaking it was heavier still. She sat frozen, caught between hunger and terror, her entire body trembling as the weight of the secret she carried threatened to break free. The silence clung to Emily like a suffocating blanket, the question James had asked still burning in her ears, pressing against her chest until she could hardly breathe. Her spoon clattered softly against the edge of the bowl as her trembling hands failed her, and she pressed her palms against her lap as though steadying herself against the weight of his stare. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the sharp intake of air that carried the taste of fear. Finally, the dam within her cracked, and her voice emerged, raw and trembling. "I lost my mother," she whispered, the words trembling into the heavy air. Her eyes glistened, spilling over with tears she could no longer hold back. "She was all I had, and when she was gone," her breath hitched. "The rest of my family didn't want me. They pushed me away, said I was a burden." Her body curled slightly as though bracing for the world's rejection again. "I didn't come here for money. I don't want anything you have. I just wanted to live." The room stilled, her fragile words hanging like broken glass in the grand space. The fire popped softly, echoing her sobs. James's gaze softened almost imperceptibly, his stern features shifting as he studied her, the wet strands of hair clinging to her pale face, the bruises on her hands, the tremor in her voice that carried a truth no liar could easily fabricate. For the first time, something cracked in the fortress of his cold demeanor. He leaned back slightly, his brow furrowing as if her pain had reached a place within him he long thought buried. But before that fragile connection could take root, a sharp voice slashed through the room. "Sir, Mark, the Bourbieu, head guard, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed, his tone edged with distrust. "You cannot take her words at face value. Girls like her," he sneered. "They trick men of wealth. They spin stories, cry tears, and slip into lives where they don't belong. She might be lying." His words dropped like stones into the silence, each syllable chipping away at the sympathy forming in James's chest. The staff murmured uneasily, torn between the suspicion voiced by Mark and the raw, undeniable suffering in Emily's eyes. Emily's face flushed with shock, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she shook her head, desperate to defend herself. "I'm not lying," she cried, her voice breaking as she clutched at the edge of the table. "I swear, I would never do that. I wouldn't even know how. Please, believe me." Her voice cracked, a plea tangled with desperation. James turned his head slowly toward her, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening once again. The warmth that had begun to flicker in his expression cooled under the weight of doubt, replaced by the sharp, unreadable mask of the man known for his ruthless clarity. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him on the table, his gaze fixed unflinchingly on the trembling girl before him. "If you're lying to me," he said, his voice low and deliberate, heavy with a threat that made the air quiver, "this will end tonight." The words thundered louder than the storm outside, striking Emily's heart with icy terror. Her breath caught, her body freezing, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress until her knuckles whitened. The staff exchanged shocked glances, some startled by the harshness of his warning, others nodding grimly in agreement with Mark's suspicions. Mrs. Thompson, still lingering near the doorway, pressed a hand to her chest, her heart aching at the sight of the girl shrinking under the weight of his words. Emily's tears spilled faster, her voice breaking as she whispered. Her small frame quivered, as though the entire mansion might collapse upon her shoulders. James's eyes burned with intensity, searching her face, her trembling lips, her tear-streaked cheeks, as if trying to pierce the very soul within her. The silence stretched unbearably, the only sounds her shallow breaths and the relentless storm outside. In that stillness, the balance of her fate teetered between mercy and cruelty, truth and doubt. And as the weight of his judgment bore down upon her, Emily's chest heaved with panic, knowing that his next decision could either shatter what little hope remained or rescue her from the darkness forever. The weight of the storm seemed to seep into the mansion itself, every gust of wind rattling the windows as if demanding to witness the verdict that hung suspended in the air. Emily's wide, tearful eyes stayed locked on James, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves as silence stretched unbearably between them. The staff stood frozen, their whispers stilled, their hearts caught in the tension of a single decision. James remained seated, his gaze unyielding, piercing her as though he could see into the deepest corners of her soul. The fire crackled faintly in the distance, its warmth failing to soften the chill that swept through the room. Seconds dragged on like hours, and Emily's trembling fingers twisted together in her lap, each heartbeat pounding against her fragile frame. Then James's chair scraped against the polished floor as he rose slowly, his height and presence commanding the entire room. Every eye followed him as he straightened, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. He stepped away from the table with measured calm, his shoes clicking softly against the marble, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence. Emily's gaze dropped instantly, dread flooding her body, her lashes wet with tears that blurred the edges of the wabibos. Bald. She braced herself for rejection, for the cold dismissal that would cast her back into the storm where she came from. His voice broke the silence, firm and resonant, steady as stone. "You asked for my doghouse." The words were sharp, almost cruel, and Emily flinched as if struck. Her shoulders curled inward, her head bowing lower, despair wrapping tightly around her like chains. She could not bear the humiliation of hearing it again, the reminder that her plea had been so small, so pitiful. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, some lowering their eyes, unable to watch the fragile girl crumble further. James paused, his breath heavy in the still air. His eyes lingered on her bent figure, the frail frame trembling before him, the stubborn spark of survival flickering despite all the storms she had endured. He took another step closer, his voice deepening, carrying not cruelty, but a finality that silenced every doubt. "But you'll never sleep there." Emily's heart cracked at the words, the sound of finality crushing her spirit. Her tears fell freely, slipping from her chin onto her lap as her lips trembled in despair. The room itself seemed to exhale in sorrow, the weight of those words pressing down like a closing door. She bit her lip hard, stifling a sob, her body folding in on itself, believing the fragile hope she had clung to was gone forever. Then came the pause, long, deliberate, and heavy with something no one dared predict. James stepped forward again, his presence overwhelming, and his voice, though still firm, softened into something the mansion had not heard from him in years. "Because from today," his words lingered, his eyes steady on her, "you'll have a room in my house." The silence shattered with gasps, the staff clasping their hands to their mouths, some already moved to tears by the sudden turn. Emily's head shot upward, her eyes wide, her tears suspended midstream as the words sank in. Her lips parted, but no sound came, disbelief flooding her expression. James's voice deepened with finality as he stepped even closer, the storm outside seeming to fade into insignificance. "You're safe now." The words carried warmth, the kind that wrapped around the soul and healed wounds long left open. Emily's hands flew to her mouth as sobs tore free, raw and unrestrained, her body trembling with relief so powerful it left her weak. Mrs. Thompson pressed her apron to her eyes, overcome by emotion, while the other staff wiped tears they could not hold back. For years, they had served a man known for his cold heart, a man untouched by pleas or poverty. Yet in this moment, that man had given away something far greater than money. He had given compassion. Emily stumbled from her chair, her knees weak, her small frame collapsing into a bow before him. "You saved me," she whispered through her sobs, her voice trembling with gratitude so deep it shook her entire being. James's stern eyes softened, his jaw loosening as he reached forward gently, lifting her chin with surprising tenderness. His gaze met hers, unflinching yet warm, and in that moment his walls crumbled in ways even he had not expected. "No, Emily." His voice dropped to a near whisper, almost reverent. "You saved me." The room fell into reverent silence, broken only by the storm retreating outside, as though even the heavens acknowledged the miracle that had taken place within the Carter estate.